And hello, everybody out there. This is David Rovics once again hosting an episode of Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern on my YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook pages, and then it goes out as a podcast afterwards if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also find it archived in both video and audio form in playlists at fifthestate.org, which is the website of Fifth Estate Magazine, which is a quarterly print publication as well as a website. And you can subscribe to the magazine at fifthestate.org. And the winter edition is the Anarchist Review of Books. And today we're spending the hour, if we don't have technical difficulties like we did last week, with Ralph Franklin, who is a fabulous musician, member of a band called the Layabouts, which has been playing around Detroit for many decades, and local organizer, originally from England, longtime friend and colleague of many people on the Fifth Estate Editorial Collective. Board, I believe it's fair to say,
Yeah, I
including the
guess so,
producer
yeah.
of this show, Peter Werby. Ralph, so far so good. We can hear each other, see each other.
Yeah,
Hope
sounds good. Well,
that continues.
won't let machines beat us today.
Just nobody move lest we unplug something. But,
Yeah, okay.
Ralph, can we talk about Detroit and the Cass Corridor? And I mean, just starting in terms of like, I don't know, here in Portland and many other cities on the West Coast, Seattle, San Francisco, as well as places like New York, Boston, there are a lot of contradictions with the class war, the racism, affordability, all sorts of those issues are, I think, in a way, very different from the issues faced in Detroit, which also, I mean, people face all sorts of challenges in Detroit, but it's a whole, it's sort of a very different situation with like the city in a state of abandonment, as opposed to everybody moving there and nobody can afford to live there, which is kind of the situation out here, you know. I don't know. Talk about I mean, at least in the popular imagination. I mean, I've been to Detroit a lot of times, but in the popular imagination, anyway, they picture a city where there may be thriving pockets of activity, but the general picture is of a place that has mostly been abandoned with a lot of buildings that are vacant. And I
Well,
wonder what's that reality like, and making something of the place as you've been doing for many decades now.
yeah, I mean, its change happened in the started in the 60s in Detroit. And Detroit was really quite a thriving town and a fairly wealthy town. You can see that through the number of brick buildings that are in the area. But it's also has always been a very racist town, and a lot like most of the big cities in the United States. And Although it started beforehand, with the uprising in '67. There was a big change that happened. That you had, a lot of white flight leaving the city. It's a city surrounded by essentially white suburbs, and
And
Detroit
you've
was
been there the whole time. This whole period we're talking about is actually your own personal. I mean, you're talking about Detroit from your personal vantage point as well. Like
yeah,
you've been there since the 50s or the 60s.
1959.
50,
Right. So yeah, so I've always lived in Detroit. I've lived in different parts of Detroit. I've lived down on the west side of Detroit. I've lived down in the Cass Corridor, and that's where most of my adult life was spent down there in the Cass Corridor. And right now, I live in Ann Arbor, which is a city about 45 miles west of Detroit. I worked at the university there, so that's where I was working. But getting back to the Cass Corridor, yeah, it's a we call it Detroit a sacrifice zone, and in other words, that Detroit was left to go, um, so that the suburbs could live quite well.
Hmm.
And you're right, there are whole sections of the neighborhoods where things are gone. But there's also a very strong community, sense of community, even in, what we would even call battle zones in the city, right? And it's a city now that is, I believe, about 80% black, and then a mixture of, white and Asian and Native Americans and whatever. And the Cass Corridor, that's always been a sort of a, I don't know what you would call it, more like the bohemian section of the city. At the north end of it is Wayne State University, which is big university in Detroit, and then at the bottom is the center of the city, and everything in between. At least during the '60s and that, were clubs and restaurants and neighborhoods and whatever. Um, it's kind of a pretty complicated history. To the east of the Cass Corridor was, and south was Black Bottom, which was a very large black community, a self-sufficient community, and that was destroyed in the early '60s. Maybe I might say started in the '50s and the early '60s, and actually the destruction of that area also led to the uprising in '67.
The destruction of that area, was it a highway project, or what was the reason for the ostensible reason for destroying the area?
Well, yeah, first of all, there's been a lot of highways in Detroit, and they all cut through the sort of the ethnic neighborhoods. Whether that be a German neighborhood, a Polish neighborhood, um, you know, um, uh, trying to think of the other kind of Irish neighborhoods and whatever. Because it being an industrial town, in the past when there were ever uprisings or strikes at factories, people didn't just have to take on the factory; they had to take on the whole community. So these freeways sort of split through it. With Black Bottom, it was a different story. I mean, there was a freeway that went through it, yes, but also what they did is they moved everybody out with the what you hear this lots of times in cities. Oh, we're going to move people out, and then they'll be able to move back into these new houses, right? Well, that wasn't the case.
That part never happens. The moving out
No.
part happens, and then the moving back part is like always kind of like, oh, they'll forget about that eventually, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
It
what
just
they
makes for a good headline.
and through a lot of shenanigans, the corporate heads and city people were able to get rid of that idea, and they built a luxury area called Lafayette Towers, and the Lafayette neighborhood around there, which became, for middle class and upper middle class people. And the people who did live in Black Bottom, were all pushed to the east and west sides and forced to live in situations. First of all, there was no thriving community anymore. All of the shops and clubs and things that they had were gone. Um, it were replaced by, white shop owners and white landlords. And in many cases, people were forced to live, 2, 3 families in an apartment. And of course, when something like that happens, tensions get really high. And you were talking about, the brutality of the Detroit police then, so it was when the uprising, came about, it's I guess in hindsight, I mean, I was pretty young when it happened, but in hindsight, you could see it coming.
And so, I mean, the uprising, though, like it gets a lot of the time that when there's urban uprisings, they get painted as being where the participants are primarily, the participants are basically painted as being what Marx would call members of the lumpen proletariat, right? But this is famously, I think anybody that's familiar with the uprising in Detroit knows that that actually it involved a lot of a broad cross section of the population, including lots of people who had decent jobs and worked for car companies and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it was a response to saying, that they weren't going to take it anymore. The people who lived in the areas where the uprising happened, um, you know, weren't going to take. Like I said, already the community was collapsed. It's been a racist city for a long time. There was a race riot in Detroit in the 40s, I believe it was. And that essentially was a white riot against blacks, and a lot of blacks were killed in the city.
After the Second World War, and these riots also were these kinds of white pogroms against black people in cities were happening across the country, and the
Right.
couple of years after the Second World War.
Yeah.
Also, after the First World War, huge always a big uptick in these kinds of activities. After
Yeah,
the
I mean,
war.
and you had people, I say uprising in the sense, there were people that were also, there were white people who took part in it. There were black people who took part in it. There were a lot of people who didn't take part in it, but in general, it was a rebellion against a collapsing standard of living and a collapsing community.
Mm-hmm.
And then also a very abusive and racist police force.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Great mix.
yeah, and it's been the continuation since then. Um, uh, that poor people and black people in Detroit really have nowhere to go. The suburbs has sort of surrounded it and shut it off, and that's why we say it was a sacrifice community. And everything started to collapse within that community. You know.
Like public services, like the occupancy of the building. I mean, like as I think the I think one of the more the moments in the movie. I know it's about Flint, not Detroit, but in Roger and Me, the movie by Michael Moore, that bit where he documents the fact that apparently the rat population in Flint was greater than the human population because so many people had moved out of the city.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the a lot of rats
I
in
don't know how
Detroit. I
that's
don't
determined, but yeah, I don't know
but
how
yeah,
you
a lot of
measure
people,
exactly the rat
those who could
population.
moved out, and those who couldn't were left in a city that was just let go. And you can't, like I said, it's a pretty complex story. You can't take the car companies away from that. There was a
Mhm.
section of Detroit here called Poletown. That was a truly integrated section of the city, and it was totally destroyed under the Coleman Young administration, so that they could put in the Cadillac plant.
Mm.
And of course, the Cadillac, and same old story. Oh, we're going to bring jobs to people and everything like that. Well, it turned out that it was mostly run by robots and machines. I think I had heard numbers that they only hired like about 300 people. So, but a whole neighborhood was destroyed.
Mm.
And I think you can make the point in Detroit and probably other cities too, that their role, the government's role and the police role was to cut down resistance, strikes, and other factories and stuff like that, and contain, sections of the population so that they couldn't take part in things. So if anything happened, you could easily come in and stop it. And in many cases, you could see that in the uprising in '67. The highway here, I-75, goes right to military bases. And another highway 94 goes to all these armories, and that wasn't by mistake, that was by plan.
Right.
And
And
when it
those also
happened,
the way the highways are set up too, it is worth noting that they are all the interstate highways are set up to be easily so it's easily possible to shut them down for the military. I mean, the entrances, as far as getting on or off any highway with a motorized vehicle, it's very easy to shut down all the highways to, traffic on or off if you're the military and you're trying to do something like that. It's
well,
by design, right?
yeah, and that's what happened in Detroit. They shut down this freeway. They brought in the National Guard, who just came in, and they were just gun happy.
Mm,
They were shooting 30 and 50 caliber machine guns into buildings and killing people. I mean, so much so that they had to bring in, paratroopers pretty much to stop them. You know,
Mm.
so it was it's a history of, like I said, it's a history of containment, um, and um, that even goes on to till this day, right here in Detroit. It's done it differently, but it's still the same way. It's an incredibly, incredibly poor city. You know.
Talk about the different ways that that the authorities use to contain people, because I mean I think that's an extremely important subject, and it's also, as you say, it's complex. It's not just simple forms of containment such as brutality.
Well, like I said, in Detroit, it's surrounded by these suburbs, and you can't get buses that go across the suburbs. I think there's one or two buses that do it, but every time Detroit's wanted to put up something like a rail system that goes from the center of the city to another city called Pontiac, that's north of here, it always gets stopped. And it gets stopped by Oakland County, which is the predominantly white county, outside. And in fact, the interesting thing, I don't know what his role would have been, but he sort of runs the county. He's dead now, but he was the person who's defended the Ku Klux Klan in the burning of buses in Detroit and Pontiac. And so
Was the Klan visible? Was the Klan a visible element in this whole scene around the time of the uprising, or at any other time since then? Is that much of a presence in terms of actually being out on the street somewhere?
Well, that no, I mean, not that in my knowledge, I don't really know. I mean, this is somebody who would know much more about this than me is Peter Werby. He has a really good take on this and what happened,
But you
and
live
he was in
around
the
there, and
middle of it.
you haven't seen. It's not like you've seen Klan marches through the suburbs of Detroit, as far as like, or have you?
No, I haven't seen Klan much, but there are what
But
we call
they're
Klan
active.
towns. I mean, the
Yeah.
Ku Klux
Uh-huh.
Klan was big in Michigan, and in fact, it was probably bigger in Michigan than it was in many places in the South.
I heard it was one of the
And
biggest centers in Michigan
yeah, a
for the
lot of
Klan.
that
Yeah.
is, workers moving up from the South to work in the auto plants, things like that. There's a city just north of here called Berkeley, part of that ring around Detroit. And it's changed now, but that was a Klan town. And
Mm.
had actually, an interesting story of a friend who had bought a house there and had the furnace replaced. And when they pulled out the furnace, there were two Klan uniforms and a Klan banner,
Wow.
and which he gave to Wayne State University to show how strong the Ku Klux Klan was in that area. You
Mm.
know,
Mm.
so no Klan rallies per se that I can remember. There were a lot of right wing groups in Detroit. So that would come to demonstrations, and there would be battles at demonstrations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of reminds me also of other forms of containment of a people, or if they happen to develop a social movement of some kind, then you can contain them by having undercover cops on on both sides of the movement to start fights with each other. That's one method of
Yeah.
containment. You can introduce lots of hard drugs into a community, and then introduce penalties for using some of them that are 100 times worse than others. I mean, there's so many different ways to keep it. But I think the quote that always comes back to me when I think about forms of containing people in situations like this is that quote of, I think it was the industrialist J.P. Morgan. I think he said, "Why should I worry about?" Basically, why should I worry about working class organizing? I can hire half the working class to kill the other half.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, in Detroit, it's the police were always called the toughest gang in town,
Yeah.
and so you had these little communities that were popping up. Well, I shouldn't say popping up; they continued. Like the Cass Corridor community where I lived in was an integrated community. It was influenced a lot by the university at the top end. There was also an area around there called that was destroyed along with Black Bottom, which was called Paradise Valley, where there was a lot of music and everything like that, and that still stayed in the Cass Corridor, and so the Cass Corridor became sort of a community, maybe in some senses of misfits. In a sense, it was radicals, musicians, um, and it was like I said, more sort of like the more bohemian section of town. So in many cases, you know, that control also led to the creation of communities and the expansion of communities that have their beginning going way back into the anti-war movement, the anti-nuclear movement, stuff like that.
Because and you say that because the communities that came around, that developed, that prospered in the Cass Corridor were kind of rooted to some extent in resistance to this project of control. Is that why they grew as the sort of in reaction to some extent?
Well, that's a hard question. I don't know if it was in resistance. I mean, it was a community in a sense that there were neighborhoods. Like I said, there were integrated neighborhoods. There was medical places. There were bars. There were restaurants that people would go to. Places for music. Um, the part of the community that I was involved in was in theater and music, and then there also the Fifth Estate was down in the middle of the Cass Corridor, and so, and it was a carry in many cases. I got involved with it during the Vietnam War. I was in high school. And looking at coming out of high school and going off to war, which is one thing I wasn't going to do. And so many of that stuff after the war ended still continued. A lot of the activities and things that people did continued down there. But it's the community takes up many different sides to it. It's not just leftists or radicals or something like that. It's just people who want to defend their community against whether it's corporation or government or the police, coming together, and that was able to be done in the Cass Corridor to a degree.
And can you talk about some of the projects that were going on or are going on that you've been involved with in the Cass Corridor, and what kind of impact they have on the broader community?
Well, well, we did the Fifth Estate. I was part of the group that started putting the Fifth Estate out as a anarchist paper in '75, and at that time also, there was publications like Black and Red, and those publications had a lot of effect down in that area that people were doing, especially the Fifth Estate. And coming out of that, we had our own theaters. We have in another section of Detroit, there was a lot of theaters, a lot of theatrical stuff that was going on where people would write their own plays. I mean, sometimes we would perform other people's plays, things like that. And they would only last for like a weekend, So I first started off with a place called Easy Space, and when that split up, there were two groups that came out of it, and one came to Detroit and it formed the Grinning Duck Club, and then the other one was the Freezer Theater. I was part of the group that organized the Grinning Duck Club. But it also included a lot of artists. There are a lot of artists around there in that area, in the Cass Corridor, and a lot of poets. So you had a very active cultural scene going on there, and of course a lot of musicians also. So and later, as later went on, that's how the Layabouts came about.
As another another Cass Corridor project that would end up lasting a very long time.
Yeah, man. Some might say too long.
No, who would say that? You're putting out great music the whole time.
Yeah, it lasted a long time. We always used to joke that we had broken up and gotten back together more times than the Rolling Stones and the Who put together. But yeah, and it came out of that area. Everyone in the band. They weren't just musicians either. I mean, they were artists. The drummer is a very well-known painter. Stephen Goodfellow, the lead singer. You've seen his stuff in Fifth Estate. He was a very well-known painter in the area. My brother was a writer, and I used to do design work, but we all
What
came
kind of
together to play music.
writing? What kind of writing and what kind of design?
Well,
What
what got me well into it is a group of writers, of which Alan was part of, and artists put out a publication in the early '70s called River Run, and that's how we came in contact with Black and Red and the Anarchist Print Co-op in the Fifth Estate, because all these groups used to share things. The Fifth Estate had typesetting equipment. Well, where do you go to typeset something, right? You go to the Fifth Estate. Where do you go to print something? Where you go Black and Red in the Print Co-op, things like that. And so there was that kind of thing going on, people writing short stories. And even to this day, Peter Werby has just written a novel,
Yeah.
about life and times in Detroit in '67.
And
And
incidentally, I'll be talking to Peter Werby next week for the show on exactly that novel.
yeah, and Peter's a wealth of information, and he's been down there, most of his life, his adult life, all of his adult life, I would imagine, doing something involved around down in the Cass corridor, and and then you had poets, a lot of poets down there. There was different radical poet groups. John Sinclair, it was part of a poetry group down there. So you see where all this stuff comes together, and then we would have like we said, a place like the Grinning Duck Club where people could come and hear poetry, hear music, hear plays, meet just to discuss what was going on in the community, things like that. And it wasn't shown as like a lefty thing, it was a community club. I think we had, I don't know, about 140, 150 members. And that's a funny, that's a long story. Why would you have members, right? But the clubs, it was always packed when there was something going on. And when
Yeah,
you talked about
and there's
police, there were
members with.
always police there too.
Oh, really? Undercovers or
Undercovers, yeah,
uniformed?
yeah.
And when you did you did you get good at figuring out who are the cops, or did it in retrospect did you have experiences where you realized oh, that person was a cop because somehow or other they got exposed later?
No, we never looked for the cops. I mean, we used to say when we started the show, there are police here. If you find them before we do, we don't care what you do. you know, and nothing ever happened. You know, the the police department down here is the 13th precinct. They made films about it and everything. It was called Siberia by the rest of the police. It was where all the rotten cops went, and they were rotten cops, And the Vice Squad was always on the take. Now we had more
And they were
trouble.
sent to that neighborhood because nobody liked the cops in that neighborhood, so nobody wanted to be a cop there, or what? Why were they sent to that neighborhood?
I don't know why they were sent there. I mean, the Cass Corridor, not only is it a center for all these things, cultural things, it was also a center for prostitution. There were a lot of drugs and things like that. Unless you were out looking for it, you wouldn't necessarily see it, So, the Vice Squad was down there, and there was another group called the Big Four, and these were just thugs. And why they were sent there, why the police called it the Siberia, I don't know. I don't know why they sent it there. I mean, it's not like like you could list off several precincts in Detroit that was just thugs. Cops using cattle prods and all kinds of stuff like that. But when we started the Duck Club up, we knew we were going to run into problems with the Vice Squad, so that's why we made it a club. Because if you were a private club, you got around all of the cabaret laws. You have to pay tax to have a band. You have to pay taxes to dancing. You can't have alcohol on the premises. Well, when you're a private club, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I've played at a lot of places where they were private clubs, and I think even just to play there, you had to join the club. But then joining the club cost $5, and you're getting paid 200, whatever it was. But yeah, everybody had to join the club, and but the cost of joining the club might not be any more than the cost of a cheap ticket to a show anyway. So it's kind of an easy little formality to get around some of those laws, right?
Yeah, that's how we used to do it. I mean, people could buy a year membership for $25. Well, this was the people who could afford it in the community, and that helped pay the rent. But when there was a show happening, we would say, yeah, you get a one night membership for $2. Well, the average price at door at a bar was like $5. So we're doing $2. Bring anything you want to drink. We don't care. It's a private club. And if you don't have enough money, we won't turn you away. We'll give you a free membership. So it was an open place, um, and nobody made any money on it. In fact, that was part of the deal. You can't make money at this club. If you're going to be performing there, you can't perform for money. You can't have a door price. This is only just to keep the club going, and nobody gets paid there. And that ran through a lot of things in the many of the activities that we took part in down there. It wasn't for wages, like I said, the Duck Club, nobody got paid for it. The Layabouts, we never took money for it.
Was that ever? I mean, I know you guys did fantastic stuff with the money when there was money, right? You would give it away and help support homeless shelters and different things. But was that whole question about taking money or not taking money, or at the Duck Club or with the layabouts, was that ever a contentious issue, just like from on an ideological level, like in terms of people who had supported the idea of labor rights and everybody getting paid for their work, and that musicians should be considered workers and all that? Was that ever an issue in your world there in Detroit, or was that just were people more had other priorities and more understood why you'd do a club like that where nobody gets paid?
It's funny you say that. People discussed it all the time. I mean, and in many cases, it was discussed in the layabouts. I mean, where a lot of it came out is I can remember with Black and Red Books, they used to have an IWW union stamp on there, and they put in there, abolish the wage system, abolish the state, all power to the workers, right? Well, as time went on, we thought, well, we're abolishing the state, abolishing the everything, and we don't want the union bug either. We're going to move on beyond that. So the debate about that started there, and it went through the whole thing. But I think, in general, people understood that they didn't want to make money. They wanted to essentially be creative, have fun. There were times. Well, I'll tell you how the layabouts would play. So we would play at a bar or something, and in those days we were, sort of one of the headline bands, and we were pulling in anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 a night at times, for playing. There were other nights, we were pulling, pennies. But if we had a band that was a warm-up band, well, they didn't necessarily have the same views that we had. So what we said was, well, you played one set, we played two sets, we'll give you a third of the door.
Which is
Well,
nothing.
well, no. If the door, if we were bringing in $1,800, that was $600.
Oh, I see. I see. So it wasn't that you're taking nothing, so you'd give them a third of nothing. I see. It
No,
wasn't
no,
like a
no,
joke or
no,
something.
no.
Okay.
And of course, for a warm-up band, warm-up bands usually get nothing, or they get $50, something like that. So they were happy, but that was, so it was
Yeah.
understanding that some people were doing it for a living and some people weren't, but we had just decided that we weren't going to. And there were also situations where, the band, we would take out what we needed to pay for rehearsal spaces and things like that. But we never took wages ourselves. There were a few members in the band that had very little money or something like that. And then, yeah, they would get money. But, so it was an ongoing discussion all the time. You know.
In Matt, I don't know if you know a guy named Matt Callahan, a musician from California, lives in Switzerland now, and used to have a band, sort of a two-person duo called Prairie Fire. But he wrote a fascinating book about the music scene in San Francisco from the mid '60s to the mid '70s. And one of the things in the book that was so interesting to me was I finally understood why all these free festivals were free, and why that was such an important emphasis for the organizers. Because like coming at it from the perspective of a working musician raised by musicians, I always looked at music as work,
Hmm.
even though, so I had that kind of orientation, but and I never really fully understood that whole, even though I also very influenced by, anarchism and cultural things like a hippie scene and punks. I mean, so I've been exposed to these ideas, but it was always a bit of a conflict until I read this book by Matt Callahan, and where he, where it was really, made where I felt, where I understood why these, like, why, I mean, there's this movie about the Grateful Dead touring across Canada, and they're getting protested by people who are protesting them for putting on shows where you had to pay to get in,
Hmm.
and that was happening across Canada in 1970. And there's a documentary about it, and I was fascinated by that because it just seems so alien. But now I think I understand it. But do you understand that? Was that like part of the scene in Detroit back in, especially around that time, that whole idea of everything being free? I mean, was that part of the cultural, sort of political cultural, an important kind of concept?
Well, I think that was part of it. I don't think people thought everything should be free. I mean, because there were the realities that you had to pay for things. You had to get things paid for. There was, though, to keep the price as low as possible. And in fact, the last time we played, we said no charge at the door. It's open. Everybody comes and hears us. It's a celebration. And so there were some outdoor festivals, where that happened, where there was no charge. Um, we also had a policy in the band, pretty much, which was that every time we played at a club for money, we had to play a free gig for the community, and that usually meant, it was a fundraiser. I mean, people were still paying, to come in and see it, but it was a fundraiser, for, and it could be for the state, it could be for the incinerator, it could be for people who are dealing with political prisoners, and we would discuss what the groups were, whether or not we wanted to play for them. We weren't going to, if the Communist Party USA said, "Would you play a benefit for us?" Well, that's not going to happen. We're just not going to do that shit. But it was mostly in the community, and what that did too is it took the ideas of the band and even the ideas of those groups beyond just like leftists or things like that. You had all kinds of people coming down, and then all kinds of people hearing and experiencing things that they may not have experienced before. You know.
So
Uh,
in terms of reaching beyond the choir, it's a really it was a really good tactic too.
yeah, and that was important for us. And the idea was also to have fun.
Yeah.
You got to have fun. One of the songs that we play is called "Fuck a Lot," and it's sort of become the song that everybody shouts for. If we don't play it, we get trouble. Whether that's in a club or whether it's at an anarchist gathering. So,
That's nice. That's a nice, happy song to get people shouting at you to play. Some of the songs that people want me to play the most are some of the ones that are the most contentious, and
oh,
that's always like, oh, please don't shout that song title. Even the title of some of them are like, oh no, don't, please don't request that one.
well, yeah. Well, the in the chorus of "Fuck a Lot," there is, you got to laugh, you got to dance, and you got to fuck, and a whole lot. And you know, that's the idea of having fun when we did things, and of course the idea with the band too. We played some songs that we didn't think were danceable, but people danced to them. I mean, we had a song called 7 Minutes, which was a rather slow song,
And
about
it went on for
how
7
long
minutes.
it takes, yeah, for a missile to hit its head. And people would
Wow.
dance to it, and I would always think, "Well, that's kinda odd," but hey, okay, you know,
You might as well dance before the missile hits. I mean, if you're gonna do anything for 7 minutes before you die, you might as well dance, I suppose,
well,
right?
that's it. I mean, we have a song called "Walking on Thin Ice," and the chorus is, "Walking on thin ice, you might as well dance." And we did, and people would dance, and they would know the lyrics, and have a good time, and it was enjoyable. It wasn't, going to some place and hearing somebody droning on about something. Instead, we're going to go have fun. We're going to listen to these politics, and we're going to raise money for something that we really agreed with. Um, and I think there was that went through a lot of the things that went on, and it was surprising how many musicians and how many poets and writers and artists wanted to take part in that.
Mhm.
They wanted to do that, and we were blatantly anti-work ethic. You know,
Yeah.
um, so as the name says, we were layabouts. No, that doesn't mean we didn't work. I mean, there were times when we tried our hardest not to work. Then we had jobs, and then we didn't have jobs. But the idea was there, and was to spread those ideas as much as we could.
Well, every time you do a show, everybody's covered in sweat by the end of it, so, I mean, people must be working, right? I mean, it's even
Well,
if
when I
it's
mean work,
fun.
I mean, when I got out of high school, I worked in a like most people in the plastic factory for Chrysler, and an auto
That's
factory.
work.
And yeah, that's work. Yeah, that's horrifying.
Horrible.
And but working at playing music, yeah, I mean, we played Anarchist Thing in Minneapolis, and I think it was supposed to be a 45-minute set. We played 2.5 hours, and
Still doesn't feel like work.
no, it was
No.
great. It was one of
Yeah.
the most exciting times of our lives. And,
When I first toured with an artist, he used to say, Robert Hoyt, he used to say, You play for free, but you get paid for all the driving."
yeah, okay.
That was his orientation anyway. I mean, of course, he also had to pay for all the gas and the
But that was
car.
well, when we played, I am trying to think if we ever got paid when we went to other cities. We go to these anarchist gatherings, and
Yeah, well, yeah.
they'd help with the gas, but they haven't got much money.
No, and they don't have money either, right?
And we
Yeah,
had to rent trucks and all that kind of stuff. But that was okay because it was something we were taking part in, and
yeah,
people wanted to hear us, and we wanted to meet them. And it turned out to be, exciting celebrations.
yeah, yeah,
You know?
wonderful. Some of the best gigs ever, I imagine. I
Yeah,
mean, it always is, isn't it? When you got people, like, coming together for something like that from all over the place. I mean, it's a pretty wonderful selected group of people, like, playing at protests. I always find it's like, wow, this is a pretty wonderful group of people that's all come together for this occasion. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, funny story. We played. We were fighting against the Detroit incinerator, and one Labor Day, I think it was Labor Day. I can't remember actually what it was for. Something the city was doing, and they were having a bunch of bands playing down at the center of the city. And of course, they didn't invite us or any sort of political bands, but we did get in to play just as the demonstration was starting. And we were told, well, you cannot do any political speeches, just play your music, right? And of course, you give, anarchist 6,000 watts, fuck, you get what we give you.
Yeah.
And we played some songs, and I can remember there were a group of high school students, or standing in front of us. There was like I don't know, city council person and the mayor and the union leaders and all these guys in neckties, and starting this demonstration. And so, like I said, we have this song called "Fuck a Lot," and we said, I don't know how we're gonna. I think I might have even said this. I don't know how to explain this song. I said, but fuck it. It's called "Fuck a Lot," and everybody in the neckties are like looking at us, and these guys chewing on their cigars, and the kids are jumping up and down, cheering. These high school students, yeah, they want to hear the song. And then after that, we played the last song, and it was called "Government's Lie." and we pointed out the people in the front row and what the city was doing. And we gave a speech that we weren't supposed to do, but hey, what are they going to do? Turn off the microphones? And we said, just like all governments, this government lies. And we did this song. Of course, the organizers told us we'd never play for one of those again, and we didn't. We were never asked again. But
Yeah.
that's okay. We got our point across, and lots of people, especially the young people, were really excited about it, and that made our day. That made our day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So there are lots of things like that, and even when we had the Duck Club, we would have plays, and there'd be so many people from the community coming that they were sitting on the. I think we could see 200 or so people, but we always overpacked it, and people were sitting on the stage,
That's
and
fantastic. And how often were events going on there?
the Duck Club lasted for about 4 years, and it's
And was it like a monthly or weekly kind of regular scheduled gathering?
No, the club was open no, I shouldn't say all the time. It had a schedule that was open, and people would take time opening. It would be like my day to go in and open the place up and sit there and make sure that if anybody wants anything, there it is. And but the plays, even like the band, it was when we wanted to do it. It wasn't. If we're not doing it for money, and we're not doing it for a livelihood, and we're not doing it to be famed. And guess what? We pick when we want to do it, and we'll pick what we'll do it for. And so all the plays were written by the people who were there. So it took a while, but all the plays were written. The first play we had was Rock Against Religion, and we were sent a graphic from. Black Flag, actually, Stuart Christie sent it to us to use for it, which was a great little graphic. And you may have seen it. It's a hand of God spraying an anarchist symbol on a wall, and these police and priests shrinking. And the place was packed.
Right.
We couldn't let it in. We've done other things like Shake Hands with Authority, which was doing a presidential campaign, and the hands were coming for your neck. And again, it was a packed show. So there was I don't know where I'm coming from, what the original question was, but it was exciting down there, and there were exciting times, and
Yeah.
and it's still
During the
going on. I mean, of course, during the days of COVID, it's not, but
Yeah, but I mean, it's still a vibrant part of town. Lots of stuff happening, right? I mean,
yeah.
prior to the pandemic, yeah.
I mean, the biggest problem now is gentrification.
And how big a problem is gentrification in that area or in Detroit generally? I mean, can you just try to paint the picture of what kind of problem are we talking about? Because I mean, I've lived in cities, just for example, where I lived in a neighborhood in San Francisco, which when I lived there 30 years ago was about 98% black, and now it's like about 98% white. I mean, so there's just in terms of race, it's and it's very much in terms of class, it's completely transformed, completely unrecognizable. But Detroit hasn't had that kind of transformation going on.
Well, it's had a lot of it going on like that. The downtown area is like that. In fact, they ran an ad once, and it was downtown. It's the new downtown gentrified. Well, they didn't use the word gentrified, but the new downtown, and it showed all these people having a great time, outdoor restaurants, cafes. And I have to say, you used to go down to Detroit, and it was dead. No, and boarded up buildings. Well, that was starting to come back alive, and there were stadiums and all this other stuff. But the whole ad were all these white people, and the only time it had black people in there is it was these chefs serving them food at a restaurant.
Seriously.
Yeah, I was just mortified. I mean, most people were. I don't know how long it stayed on, but I'll show you how much it changed. The Cass Corridor is now called Midtown, and that kind of gives you an idea.
Where
Oh,
they're
Cass
going.
Corridor.
Think New York.
And but I have to say there's a lot of people there that won't do that. There's a bumper sticker that Midtown say no, it's the Cass Corridor, and there's even a radio station down there, public radio, that don't say we're coming from Midtown. They say we're coming from the Cass Corridor.
Nice.
And so there's a lot of resistance to it. As far as I would say, Yeah, I would say the majority of people that are moving into these gentrified areas are white. Um, I don't know, I don't want to say, hey, that's just because you're white, that's a negative thing. I mean, there are a lot of people there, a lot of caring people, what's going on, but it's pretty much a middle class and upper middle class movement. I mean, you've got houses in the Cass Quarter. You know, when I left there, I had a 4-bedroom row house that I was renting, and I was paying $325 a month plus utilities. You
And
know,
let's be clear, we're talking for all 4 bedrooms.
yeah, we're talking about the whole house. Yeah, you know.
Because I know there are people listening to that who automatically assume you're talking per bedroom, and that's a great deal. But no, this is for all four, by the way,
No, of
all you
course.
Californians watching this.
And I mean, that was even maybe. I mean, I shouldn't say too much. That's a bit of a rarity. I lived there for a long time, but they, 2-bedroom apartments were pretty inexpensive.
Yeah.
And now they were the greatest places in the world, but they were nice places, and it depended on what you got. You know, well, now they're selling houses at the start of $580,000.
Whoa, whoa,
Uh,
whoa, whoa.
and there are apartments there that are going from anywhere from 1,800 to like $2,800 a
Oh,
month.
that's awful. So what people are leaving now? A lot of people are leaving.
A
It
lot of
must be
people
very
moved.
disruptive.
Yeah, a lot of people moved, and there's still, but there are still, pockets of resistance, I would say, down there.
Yeah.
There's bookstores down there. There's different projects that are going on there. Even restaurants that fight that,
Mm.
and make food as inexpensive as possible, pay the workers extremely good wages, and things like that. I mean, they still think of it as a community,
Yeah.
but but it's changing quite a bit,
What a shame.
uh, and of course, what's changing that is you have a huge medical centers being built, 3 stadiums, and so the money isn't going to people who live there to rebuild their houses. The money is going there for people to tear down their old places and put up new stuff.
Yeah.
You
And
know.
it's so strange how many towns there are where the main industry is a hospital. Like, I just wonder when I've lived in them too, like New Haven, and how does that work? Like, oh, the main thing that pays anybody here is when everybody gets sick. Like, what else do people do in this town? But when when you were when you were living there as a young person and young adult facing the potential of being drafted to go to Vietnam, were you the war was still on and you were an adult already, right? That was
No, after I got out of high school, my number I think was 242 or something like that, and then they put a freeze on it. But when I was in high school, we were looking forward, and we would hitchhike, down into the Cass Corridor, you
hmm
where the demonstrations going on, and so.
what were the demonstrations like in the Cass Quarter around the Vietnam War at the time? Was that anti-war demonstrations you're talking about?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I can remember one, hitchhiking down there and being picked up some people who were going to it, and my recollection about what was going on in there. I was just a high school kid going in there for these demonstrations. I mean, we used to get the Fifth Estate at high school. They would pass it out, and you'd find out about these demonstrations. So we'd go down to the Fifth. And the Fifth Estate was one of the widest read, alternative newspapers in the area, counterculture newspapers. And the demonstrations were, noisy and people marching down the street. I don't ever remember any violence, although, other people who had been there, I mean, I knew somebody who, had their leg broken by a cop. The cops were chasing him. I believe the story was that he jumped over a wall and either twisted his ankle or broke his leg, and the police came in and just started smashing on his broken leg with a stick. Typical cop activity. And so there were some that were, very contentious and very violent, but none that I went to.
And when you were at least in high school, I don't know if you were thinking about it much, but being your parents are from England, and were you thinking about the prospect of avoiding the draft by going to England?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You know, my father was in the World War II, and he didn't want any of us to go to war.
Mm,
But an interesting thing happened. My brother, my oldest brother, was drafted and went to Vietnam.
mm,
And my parents didn't want him to go, but he went. And he ended up being, I think, one of 3 or 4 people in his platoon left alive. And
wow.
he was shot several times. They took 100% casualties.
Mm,
And but he came back. You know, in those days, you know, they didn't have to. The military didn't tell you your kid was in Vietnam. It's up to the soldier to tell him. And
wow.
all
The
male,
military just says he's deployed.
well, the all male went to Japan, right? And my brother said he was in Korea, and he didn't want to say he was in Vietnam because he would upset my parents. But I can remember when we he got back a little while after he was back, and they would send these uh, pieces of paper to us. Don't wake him up. Don't touch him if you're going to wake him up. He may have strange eating habits and things like that. You know, I think, what the hell did you do
Mm,
in Korea? You know, I mean,
right.
what kind of
Mm,
strange eating habits are going to have from that? Well, it was because he was out in the field in Vietnam,
yeah.
and one day, my other brother Alan, who was in the band with me, he and I were going shopping with my brother, who had just come back from Vietnam, and we got about a block from the house. My brother pulled the car off, and he looked at Alan and I, and he said, "If either of you think about joining the military, I'll kill you first." And we thought he was joking. We were, oh yeah, yeah. He said, "I'm not joking. I'll kill you first." He just turned around, put the car in gear, and kept on driving. Well, even at that
Wow.
time, we didn't know he was in Vietnam. We were, you know, he hadn't told us. I found out many years later, and but no, I wasn't going to. My Alan actually left the country, you know, but I wasn't going to go fight in Vietnam.
And where was your father during the Second World War?
He was in England. He was a navigator of heavy bomber and Lancasters, and took part in some horrendous bombings during World War II that, you know, changed his life forever. Uh,
Bombing German cities, or
Fire bombs, yeah,
yeah,
Dresden, Hamburg, things like that. And but he was, you know, dead against war after that. You
yeah,
know, a lot of discussions in the house about it and things like that. But yeah, I wasn't going to go to war, and that's why we went to these demonstrations, and of course at that time the nation had turned against it. You know, I could remember my senior year in high school. You know, it was always I always had long hair, and it was always some sort of contention between the long hairs and the jocks. You know, and I can remember coming back in the senior year, and all the jocks had grown their hair long, and they were smoking dope, and they were saying, "I'm not going to Vietnam." You know, it had changed the entire country. So, you know,
and then it's also like you're probably many, if not most, of your friends at that time would have also had fathers who were in the Second World War. Would that be accurate statement? I mean, it was there that kind of a little bit more of kind of certain kind of homogeneousness in your group because there's this shared background, right?
It was kind of mixed, you know. I was the youngest in the family, you know, but you know, other kids who may have been the oldest, their parents maybe didn't go to war, you know, or they had something to do with the Korean War, you
Right.
know, something like that. And in fact, I had an uncle, again, back to the Cass Corridor, who went to the Korean War, came back and opened up a club down there called the Cup of Socrates, which was a jazz club, you know, down in the Cass Corridor.
Hmm.
And um, but I think in many cases, yeah, there were some people whose parents did. You know, I mean, I had an uncle who was, you know, won medals of honor in World War II, and he was dead against the war. He was not going to let his kids go to war. That wasn't
Mm.
going to. So I think, you know, a lot of it had changed. You know. And so consequently, there was also, a lot of support in some degrees of the anti-war movement and stuff that was going on in you know in high schools at that time. I mean, I remember the Fifth Estate coming to the high school, and the school didn't do anything to stop them. Yeah, it was fine.
Mm.
And I remember even getting caught skipping school to go to a demonstration, and the uh, I don't know if you call it truant officer, but the person who was determined with your attendance said, "Look, next time, don't get caught." That was his response.
Excellent.
But all that led to, introduction to the Cass Corridor, and then doing things, at the Fifth Estate, and a lot of those ideas. It's not like you walk in and those ideas are there. This was a lot of discussions. A lot of arguments. Even when I say arguments, they're not people punching each other, but people getting pretty. They're very very strong about their feelings. But even when it was the Duck Club or even the Layabouts, there was always a lot of discussions. There were no leaders, and that made it harder, and that made it better. It's easier to follow a leader and just do as you're told. But if everybody gets to have an equal voice and you say things, well, that's really hard work. But what comes out of it is really good.
Mm. This has been a fascinating hour. I don't know where it quite all went, Ralph, and I still want to talk about a whole bunch of other things, but I guess we should save it for another time. Because I'm told that people lose attention after a while. I'm told that a half hour is the format I should be doing because but I think that's too short. So,
well, this has been great. It's been great,
yeah.
and I hope I hope people get to hear the Layabouts. It's hard to find. We have 2 recordings.
Yeah, speaking of that, are you going to try to do anything about that, by the way? Because, I mean, you got recordings, you got more than 2. You have a lot of recordings, right? You put out a bunch of albums, and none of them are online. And are you going to do anything about that, or are you dead set in principle against that, or what's the? Are we going to have? Is the Layabouts going to continue with us in any non-physical form in the future?
Well,
As
that's
everybody,
another whole discussion. Why we didn't put it on live. I mean, remember, those things weren't around those times, and we had many discussions about we didn't want to do videos. Some people did, some people didn't. We did put out 2 albums. We put out one, a vinyl album that was called No Masters,
mm-hmm.
and that his master's voice, the RCA. My dog looked like that, and so we had pictures of my dog tearing up a record player, and his master's voice was crossed out, and it said "No Masters." And then the second one is called Relax, but the full name is Workers of the World Relax, and it's got 2 picto people on it, and one it says a picto person shoveling doing work. And it says work, and then there's 2 boxes, yes, no, and of course no is checked. And then there's another group of 2 picto people dancing, and it says dance, yes, no, and of course that's yes. And those are the 2 recordings we had. Are they hard to get? I mean, if people, if people want them or something like that, I mean, I don't even know how you could do it. I guess you could write me via the Fifth Estate, although I'm not much at the Fifth Estate that much, and they're probably going to hate me for doing this. But
But are you wouldn't want to put them up on Spotify and stuff in principle? I mean, this is definitely a subject for another discussion, and it's a very rich subject, I think. But I mean, which I also have a lot of thoughts on. But I mean, it's a very conflicted thing, of course. Like just the fact that we're doing this broadcast right now on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I mean, there's a lot of complexities in life. But are you dead set against having those albums up on Spotify, or is that something that if that the band would agree on doing potentially?
I don't think we're dead set against it. We all layabouts, and we just haven't fucking
So
done.
somebody
And
somebody has to take the initiative. Yeah.
I think the other thing too is that the band was much more into playing live and playing in the community. That was the important part of it, and also saying, "Hey, anybody can do this." None of us are trained musicians. Not a single. Well, I shouldn't say that the violin player was, but none of us. And we figured it out as we went along. And it's nice to do recordings and things like that. But we just wanted to play live. So I don't know. I have to think about it. I'll have to talk to the band, which is scattered all over the world these days, and find out. Maybe we should put it up online.
Yeah, well, if they want to do it, I'll be very happy to help you with that process.
Okay, I'll take you up on that. Take you up on that. All right.
Great talking to you, Ralph.
Well, this has
I'll
been great. Thank you
see
very
you
much.
again. Thank
All
you.
right. Bye bye.
Bye bye. And thanks everybody for tuning into this discussion with Ralph Franklin of the band The Layabouts, activist and musician from the Detroit area, and also friend and colleague and comrade of the man who I'll be interviewing next week, who is longtime Fifth Estate editorial collective member and also longtime Detroit area talk show host and now novelist, Peter Werby, who has just written a novel about Detroit in the 60s, which I'm really looking forward to both talking to him about and reading. Okay. Remember, mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors. Bye for now. I'll be back tomorrow for my discussions with David show on the same platforms at the same time to talk to a longtime college professor and author of many fascinating books from Boston, Massachusetts, George Katsiafikas. Bye for now.